Hello everyone, I am Hollow Knights, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. But before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also let me know what you think of the story in the comments below. Now get comfortable and relax. Rain streaked the windows of the Greyvale train as it groaned to a stop at the final station. The town was barely a dot on the map, an ink smudge in the folds of Westwood's forgotten hills. Eleanor pressed her forehead to the cold glass, her breath fogging a circle that framed the tiny platform. One flickering lamppost illuminated the cracked concrete and a rusted sign. Greyvale? Miss Fenright? A voice called out from the shadows. She turned. A tall man stood just outside the train's exit, his posture too stiff to be natural, as though he'd practiced it in a mirror. He wore a long wool coat, soaked from the rain, and his pale face looked etched in worry. "Yes," Eleanor replied, stepping off the train with her suitcase. "You must be Mr. Thorne?" He nodded. "You came highly recommended. Miss Ivor spoke of your talents." "I'm not a medium," Eleanor corrected, her voice cool. "I study paranormal architecture, old homes, folklore, and what people claim they've seen." Thorne offered a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "You'll find plenty of that at Hearthmore House." They climbed into a black car waiting by the woods. As it rolled forward, Eleanor noticed how fast the trees swallowed them. The headlights barely pierced the dense fog that hugged the road like a shroud. She sat back, eyes drifting to the old folder Thorne handed her. Inside, yellowed newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and a brittle letter written in elegant script. "To whom it may concern, the house is not empty. It listens. It remembers. Please do not stay past the third night. L.W." That was from the last caretaker, Thorne said. "Found it near the hearth, tucked behind a loose stone." Eleanor frowned. What happened to them? He didn't answer. They arrived just past midnight. Hearthmore loomed at the hilltop like a blackened crown. Spires pierced the night sky. Windows glared like hollow eyes. The house seemed to inhale. As she stepped out of the car, "You're sure this place is abandoned?" she asked. "No," Thorne replied, staring at the upper floors. "That's what worries me." The front doors of Hearthmore groaned open under their own weight, their iron hinges shrieking like a warning cry. Eleanor crossed the threshold with measured steps, the floorboards moaning beneath her boots. The smell of old wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic like rust or blood filled the air. Thorne lit a pair of gas lanterns from the hallway, casting trembling shadows across the walls. Electricity's temperamental. Most of the wiring's been eaten away by time, he muttered. Eleanor swept her gaze around the grand foyer. Twin staircases curved upward like ribs into darkness, and a massive fireplace yawned at the far end, its mantel etched with strange symbols. She paused, stepping closer to the hearth. "This is the one, isn't it?" she asked, brushing her fingers against the stone. Thorne nodded. "That's where we found the letter. But it's older than that. People say it was built before the rest of the house, before there was a house." Eleanor raised a brow. "A hearth built before the home?" He shrugged, uncomfortable. "That's just what the locals say." He gave her a room on the third, floor dusty but livable, and said he'd return in the morning. "I don't sleep here," he added, already backing toward the exit. "I figured." She stood in the middle of her room long after he'd gone, staring at the ornate wallpaper. Roses, thorns, and tiny, hidden faces peered out between the vines. She thought it was a trick of the light, until one of them blinked. Eleanor turned on her heel, heart thudding in her chest. She swept the lantern across the room. Nothing. Just an old mirror, her own reflection. The wallpaper unmoving. "It's just nerves," she muttered to herself. Long ride, old house, crumbling sanity. She unpacked slowly, laying out her notebooks, camera, and recorder. She was here to study, not believe. But belief had a habit of creeping in with the dust. Around 3 a.m., just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard a sound from the hall. Not footsteps scraping, like wood dragging across stone. Then came the whisper. It wasn't in English. And it wasn't coming from outside the door. It was coming from under her bed. Eleanor froze. Her breath hitched as the whispering grew clear, guttural. Syllables she couldn't place, like a prayer mumbled backward through rotting teeth. Slowly she sat up in bed, the thin mattress creaking beneath her. The sound stopped. She leaned over the edge and peered down. Darkness. Grabbing her lantern, she knelt on the floor and lowered it to the dusty wooden boards. Its glow crept beneath the bed, revealing nothing. No creatures, no shadows. Just a pair of old, leather-bound books she hadn't brought with her. Frowning, she pulled them out. Both were coated in a thick layer of grime, their covers embossed with faded gold lettering. One read, The Hollow Hearth, a chronicle. The other, Voices from the Stone. She hadn't packed either of these. The moment she opened the first book, the lantern flickered. The air seemed to compress, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Inside the book were journal entries dated between 1831 and 1867, all written in the same sharp, angular hand. The fireplace burns cold. The fire is false. I see her in the embers now, her mouth moving but her voice buried beneath stone. There is a man made of smoke who stands at the foot of my bed. He does not blink. He waits until I do. The third night is hers. Eleanor felt a chill race across her spine. She placed the book down and turned toward the mirror. There was a figure in it. It stood just behind her. A tall woman in a black veil, her face featureless, the veil gently rippling as if underwater. Eleanor whipped around. Empty room. When she turned back to the mirror, the woman was gone, but something else had changed. Her own reflection now held the book she'd just placed on the floor. She dropped the lantern. It shattered, plunging the room into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, its flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. Grabbing the two books, she backed into the hallway, clutching them like a shield. The house was silent again, too silent. Until the scraping sound returned. Only this time, it wasn't under her bed. It was coming down the hallway, getting louder. With each breath she took. Eleanor held her breath. The scraping sound, slow, deliberate, heavy, echoed down the corridor. Her flashlight jittered across the wallpaper, casting jittery shadows that writhed where there should have been stillness. She pressed herself against the wall and listened. Scrape, drag. Scrape, she moved, keeping her steps light, following the hallway away from the sound. The floor groaned underfoot like a warning sigh. She passed closed doors, some warped with age, others slightly ajar. All seemed to whisper as she passed, sighing through unseen cracks. She turned a corner and froze. The corridor ahead was lined with paintings, dozens of portraits, all lifelike and all unsettling. They depicted residents from across centuries. It seemed men in powdered wigs, women in black lace, children with pinched expressions. Yet all had one thing in common. Their eyes had been scratched out, not painted over, gouged, ripped clean from canvas. Eleanor's flashlight flickered as she stared into the hollow sockets. Some seemed to weep crimson streaks that bled down the frames. One painting at the far end had not been defaced, that it was a portrait of a woman tall, gaunt, and draped in mourning black. Her eyes were dark and deeply human, too human. As if she could see her. Suddenly, Eleanor's flashlight died. In total darkness, she heard breathing. Right next to her ear, she ran. Hands brushed the walls as she darted down a second corridor, heart hammering in her chest. Behind her, she heard the scrape again, faster now, as if whatever had dragged itself before was gaining strength. She stumbled into a stairwell, barely catching herself on the railing. As she descended, she heard the whispering again, clearer now. The third night is hers, and you've already begun. A door creaked open at the bottom of the stairs. Warm light spilled out. Without thinking, Eleanor stepped through and stopped. She stood in the library, but it was impossible. The library had been locked. Thorne said the key was missing. Yet here she was, surrounded by shelves that reached toward a vaulted ceiling of carved wood and dust-covered chandeliers. Books lined every wall, many bound in leather so cracked they looked fossilized. At the hearth at the far end burned, though no one had lit it. And in the flickering orange light, a figure stood waiting. The figure stood motionless by the fire, arms clasped behind its back, head tilted slightly toward the flames. At first, Eleanor thought it might be a statue thin, elongated limbs and skin like wax, but then it moved. It turned toward her. He was an older man in a long, tattered waistcoat, his face lined like cracked parchment. Spectacles sat at the end of a long nose, though they reflected no firelight. His eyes, milky white, still seemed to see her. "You came," he said simply. Eleanor found her voice. "Who are you?" "I am what remains," he replied, stepping away from the hearth. "I was the first to read the house." She frowned. "You mean live in it?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "You live in a house. This house reads you. It finds your margins, your secrets, your binding, and turns the pages." He reached for one of the books under her arm, voices from the stone, and his hand hovered over it without touching. "This one has your name written in it now. I never wrote in it. You didn't need to." Eleanor took a step back. "What do you want?" The old man looked at her with pity. "Want? No. I am only a bookmark, child. A memory pressed between the chapters. But she wants what she always has." "Who is she?" Eleanor demanded. He turned and gestured toward the hearth. She was the first spark, the fire that refused to go out. When they built the house around the hearth, they sealed her in. But wood rots, stone cracks. And now she's beginning to turn the last page. The fire flared behind him, sending his shadow stretching across the shelves like a claw. Eleanor stepped back. "You need to leave this place," he whispered, "before the house finds your ending." "I can't," she said. "I came to find the truth." The old man smiled, and for a moment she saw bone behind his teeth. "Then you'll find it. But the truth costs ink and blood in this place." He raised a hand, and the walls around her began to shift. The books rearranged themselves. Shelves moved. The door behind her vanished entirely. "You'll have to write your way out." Then, like a dying flame, the librarian vanished, and the fireplace roared to life with screams. The flames howled like a storm, a twisted chorus of anguish echoing off the library walls. Eleanor backed away, clutching the books tightly to her chest. The heat radiating from the hearth was unnatural. It didn't warm her skin, only made the air heavier, as if grief itself were pouring out of the fire. Then the room shifted. She felt it not just in her feet, but in her bones. The walls pulsed once, and suddenly the shelves were gone. The chandeliers above melted into black vines that crept along the ceiling. She blinked. She was no longer in the library. Now she stood in a narrow room lit only by candlelight. A long wooden desk sat in the center, and atop it, a blank journal, its cover bound in something that looked disturbingly like skin. A single quill rested beside it, the tip dipped in red ink that glistened like fresh blood. The hearth was still here, but now the flames were low, pulsing in time with her breath. A voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Write it down, all of it." Eleanor slowly approached the desk, her hands trembling. She opened the journal and saw that the pages weren't blank after all. The first entry read, Night 1. The house opens its eyes. It watches. It remembers. She turned the next page. Night 2. The guest becomes the host. Memory is the meal. The third page was blank except for the heading. Written in that. Same blood ink. Night 3. A whisper rose behind her, curling around her neck like cold fingers. Write or be written. She sat down, and began. She wrote about the train, the journey, the whisper beneath the bed. As her quill scratched across the page, the room seemed to lean in. Shadows gathered behind the desk, and the fire turned blue. Time thickened, like molasses in her mind. When she looked up, she was no longer alone. Standing across the desk was a girl no more than 10 years old. Her eyes were sewn shut with coarse black thread. Her dress was ash-stained. Her mouth opened, but made no sound. Then, in a voice that wasn't her own, she whispered, You can't write her out. You can only write yourself in. The candles blew out. Darkness fell, and the journal turned its next page by itself. Eleanor stood up so fast, the chair behind her toppled with a crash. The journal snapped shut on its own, and when she tried to open it again, the cover resisted, as though it had grown teeth beneath the leather. The little girl was gone. Only the smell of scorched fabric remained. She backed away from the desk and reached for the book she'd carried in. But they too were gone. In their place, written across the floorboards in fresh red letters, was a single word, Downstairs. The walls creaked around her, as if sighing. Then the room itself began to shrink. Not metaphorically. The ceiling inched downward. The desk pressed closer to the walls. The hearth, though dying, emitted a guttural sound, a low growl. Deep and animal. Eleanor ran. She threw open the only door and burst into a stairwell that hadn't been there before. It spiraled sharply downward, its steps carved from old stone and slick with damp. She descended quickly, the walls sweating beside her. Whispering in voices she couldn't translate. At the bottom was a corridor lit with flickering lanterns. And a wall of names. Hundreds of them. Etched deep into the stone, some scratched by fingernails, others burned into the rock by flame or acid. Some names were full and proud. Others had been crossed out or buried under darker stains. She stepped closer. Near the bottom, still fresh, was her own name. Eleanor Fenright, etched neatly, precisely. Beneath it, 2 words had been added just recently. So recently that the scratches still flaked with red. Chapter 1. No, she whispered. No, this is not a story. I'm not a story. But the wall disagreed. From the corridor's end, she heard footsteps fast, erratic. Then a scraping sound again. Closer, closer. A light ahead flared and died. She darted forward into another hall and opened the nearest door she could find. It led into a small room filled with children's toys, dolls, wooden blocks, a rocking horse that swayed, though no wind stirred. And in the corner, a shadow stood, facing the wall. It was sobbing. She tried to back away slowly, but the door behind her slammed shut, and the voice came again, no longer a whisper. Night 3 has begun. The shadow in the corner twitched as Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. It didn't turn at first, it shuddered, jerking in fits like a marionette with cut strings. The sobbing deepened, wet and childlike, yet guttural in ways that didn't belong in a child's throat. She took one careful step back. The floorboard squealed. The figure froze. Its head turned snapped toward her, revealing a face with no features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just stretched. Skin over a vaguely human skull. And then it charged. Eleanor barely had time to scream. She flung herself aside as the thing collided with a pile of stuffed animals, sending porcelain-faced dolls skittering across the room. She scrambled for the door, yanking at the handle locked. She slammed her shoulder into it again and again, desperate, as the faceless shadow twisted up from the floor behind her, arms outstretched like black branches. One of its hands dripped with something thick and black. "Open," she shouted, and on her final slam the door gave. She tumbled into another hallway, this one lit only by narrow slats of moonlight filtering through warped windows. Behind her, the shadow didn't follow. It just stood in the playroom's doorway, head tilting slowly to one side, almost. Curious dot, then it vanished, folding into the darkness like paper into a flame. Eleanor fled. She didn't know where she was going anymore. The house changed behind her with every turn. Staircases where closets had been. Hallways that spiraled like corkscrews. Doors that opened to brick walls. And beneath it all, that same whispering. Third night. Third night. She writes in fire now. She turned a corner and nearly collided with Thorn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His skin was pale, eyes wild. "You stayed?" He rasped. "You weren't supposed to stay past night 2, God help us." "What is happening?" she snapped. "What is this place?" He grabbed her shoulders. "She's waking up. The house is hers. Always has been. Who is she?" Eleanor demanded. Thorn looked past her, down the corridor where the faceless shadow had stood. Then he whispered, "The one in the hearth." Eleanor stared into Thorn's hollow eyes. "The one in the hearth?" she repeated. "What does that mean? A ghost? A demon?" Thorn's voice dropped to a whisper, thick with dread. She was the first. Before the house, before the stones, there was a woman burned at this hilltop, accused of witchcraft. The villagers dragged her from the woods and built a pyre butt. She didn't scream. She sang. "That's just folklore," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. He shook his head violently. "They built the hearth on her ashes. Her bones are in the foundation." Every stone above was laid in silence because no one dared speak her name. But they forgot one thing. She was listening. The hallway trembled beneath their feet. Faintly, behind the walls, something moved. Something massive, brushing against. The skeleton of the house, like a serpent in the walls. Thorn leaned in close. "She doesn't haunt this place. She is this place." A sudden creak made them both jump. At the end of the hallway, a door had appeared. A door neither of them remembered. It was narrow, iron-bound, and breathing. Not swinging, not creaking, breathing, as though the house itself exhaled through. She's pulling us in," Thorn muttered. "She wants us to see it? The hearth?" Eleanor asked. "No," he said. "The beginning." The door swung open without a sound. Inside was pitch black. "Are you going in?" he asked. "I have to. This is what I came for." Thorn hesitated. "Then I'm coming with you." They stepped through the threshold together, and the door vanished behind them. No sound, no wind, no click, just gone, as if it had never been. Their inside, the darkness was complete, until, one by one, tiny lights bloomed in the void, floating embers, glowing red as they drifted through the air. They lit the room slowly, a vast underground chamber shaped like a heart. Walls curved inwards and pulsed with light, and at the center, set into a pit of blackened brick, was the original hearth. Cold. Empty. But whispering. Eleanor stepped closer. The whispers were loud now, voices of every soul who had ever entered the house. She heard her own among them. And then she heard something else. A voice. Female. Warm. Calling her name. Eleanor. Eleanor. The voice wrapped around her, like velvet, inviting, comforting. It didn't belong in a place like this. It felt maternal. Thorn stood at the edge of the hearth pit, staring down into the coals. "She's awake," he whispered. "She's inside the stone." Eleanor took another step forward. The cold from the hearth seeped into her bones, but the voice made her forget the chill. "You came to study me," it said. "You asked for the truth." She dropped to her knees and brushed her hand along the hearth's inner ring. The stone wasn't just cold, it was soft, like decayed skin. Beneath, a layer of soot, something glimmered. She reached out and uncovered it. A ring of tiny teeth embedded into the STONEWORK dot infant teeth. "Oh God!" She breathed. Thorn backed away, his face pale. This is where she was bound. They built the hearth around her. The voice deepened, still soft, but more forceful. "I was never bound. They fed me to the fire. They thought it would kill me. But fire is just another door." Eleanor suddenly saw flashes images, not from her memory, but from hers. Screaming villagers. A blood-red moon. The sound of chanting, reversed and stretched. Children sobbing as they were pulled into the hearth for rituals long forgotten. "You're showing me," Eleanor gasped. "You're not just a spirit. You're a memory, flame, hunger. I am the story that tells itself." A sudden force yanked her forward. Her hand brushed deeper into the hearth, and for a split second, her fingers passed through the stone. It was no longer solid. It was mouth, and it breathed her in. Thorn screamed. "Eleanor, get away from it!" But she couldn't move. Inside the stone, something ancient uncurled, long limbs like branches. A body of smoke and cinders. A mouth that didn't open, but unfolded, spilling forgotten names into the world. Teeth in the hearth began to chatter. A shape emerged behind her in the pit, rising from ash. The woman in the black veil, taller than before, her hands like burning iron, her face still hidden. "Write my name," she hissed. "Bring me back." Eleanor snapped free of the trance, scrambling away from the hearth, her hand seared where she touched it. Thorn dragged her to her feet. "We have to go," she choked. But behind them, the hearth was no longer just stone dot, it was opening. The hearths, blackened bricks twisted and cracked like an ancient wound reopening. Flames poured out not orange or yellow, but a sickly blue, thick as smoke, licking the air with hunger. Eleanor stumbled backward, clutching her scorched hand, while Thorn frantically scanned the walls for an exit. The chamber seemed to pulse breathe as. The fire spread, but it didn't consume wood or stone. Instead, it flowed upward, dripping like liquid night, carving shadows into the air. A voice echoed through the chamber, not from the hearth this time, but from the very walls themselves. "You invited me in." The figure of the woman in black stepped fully from the hearth's pit, her veil unraveling into tendrils of smoke. Her hands were now claws of ember, and her face remained an unreadable void. Eleanor felt cold fire crackle along her skin. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Thorn grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a narrow tunnel, carved behind a collapsed wall. "Come on," he urged. They ran through the twisting passage, the whispers growing louder, crawling through the cracks in the stones like crawling insects. The tunnel opened into a small underground chamber. A door, old and splintered, stood between them, and the night dot Eleanor pushed it open, and they burst outside. The rain had stopped. The moon hung low, a pale witness. Behind them, Hearthmore House sat silently on its hilltop, as though nothing had changed. But Eleanor knew better. The house was alive, and so was she dot Eleanor, and Thorn collapsed on the damp grass outside Hearthmore, lungs burning from their desperate escape through the underground passage. The night was eerily still, no whispering winds, no creaking branches, only the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of a lone owl. Thorn wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. He made it out for now. Eleanor's gaze lingered on the dark silhouette of Hearthmore looming above them. The windows gleamed like empty eyes, watching. The house had let them go, but it was waiting, always waiting. "I don't understand," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If she's trapped in the hearth, why did she let us leave?" Thorn shook his head. "Because she needs a story. She needs someone to keep her alive. Every visitor becomes part of her tale, and the more she's remembered, the stronger she grows." Eleanor swallowed hard. "So, what happens now?" "Now, we make sure the story doesn't end here," Thorn said. "We burn the hearth, destroy the fire that never dies." Eleanor looked back toward the house, the weight of the journal still heavy in her coat pocket. The words inside whispered to her even now, but as she stood, something cold brushed her arm like a finger, soft and fleeting. She turned sharply. Nothing but shadows. The night held its breath, and Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, the sun crept over the horizon in dull gray streaks, barely piercing the heavy mist that clung to the valley below Hearthmoor. Eleanor and Thorn returned cautiously to the foot of the hill, armed with an old map, a crowbar, and a coil of rope. The townsfolk, when they saw them, averted their eyes and crossed the street quickly. No one spoke of Hearthmoor anymore. The path up to the house was tangled with overgrowth, as if the forest was reclaiming the cursed ground. Branches scratched at Eleanor's face, and the wind whispered mournfully through the leaves. They reached the porch, the wood swollen and rotten. Thorn pushed open the front door with a grunt. The familiar darkness swallowed them whole. Inside, the house was quieter, almost respectful of the daylight. Dust motes drifted in the stale air, settling on shattered chandeliers and cracked floorboards. But the hearth remained cold. Unlit. Eleanor approached cautiously. She pulled the journal from her coat and laid it on the mantel. "We are going to end this," she said firmly. Thorn nodded and set to work prying loose the heavy stones around the hearth. As he worked, Eleanor watched the walls. The faces in the wallpaper seemed to twist, some pleading, some laughing silently. Suddenly, the floor trembled. The walls groaned. From the shadows, the faintest whisper rose once again. "You cannot erase the story." Eleanor swallowed her fear and grabbed a nearby lantern. "Then we write the ending." She uncapped a bottle of kerosene and poured it slowly onto the hearth. Stones. Thorn lit a match and touched it to the soaked bricks. The fire caught quickly, blue flames licking upward, sending sparks swirling. The house screamed. The faces on the walls contorted as if in pain. The floor shook violently. And then, just as suddenly as it began, silence. The hearth was ash-dot. The house stood still. Eleanor exhaled slowly, but deep beneath the rubble, something shifted. Eleanor stepped back from the hearth, watching as the last tendrils of blue flame curled and died into gray ash. The oppressive weight that had hung over Hearthmoor seemed to lift just slightly, but a shiver ran down her spine. Something wasn't finished. Thorn crouched beside the fire pit, brushing ash from the cold stones. "It's over," he said, voice hollow. Eleanor wasn't so sure. The air smelled different, less stale, but sharper, almost electric. The shadows seemed deeper, darker. The house, though quiet, felt awake. She picked up the journal from the mantel. The pages were untouched by flame, but as she flipped through, new words appeared, written in her own hand. "The fire has died, but the story remains." A sudden creak echoed from upstairs. Both of them froze. The portraits in the hallway, the ones with the eyes gouged out, now had eyes again. Slowly, those eyes turned toward Eleanor and Thorn, watching. A whisper, barely audible, came from the far end of the hall. "The last chapter is yet to be written." Eleanor's heart hammered. She looked at Thorn. "What now?" she asked. Thorn's lips pressed tight. "We leave, and we never come back." She nodded. But as they made their way to the front door, Eleanor's eyes caught a faint glow coming from beneath the floorboards in the foyer. The hearth was dead, but the fire was not. Eleanor dropped to her knees, brushing aside the loose floorboards with shaking hands. Beneath, an eerie blue light pulsed soft and steady, like a heartbeat. She reached down, fingers trembling as they brushed the glow. The light wasn't fire. It was something else, something alive. Thorn knelt beside her, eyes wide. It's not gone. Suddenly, the flame flared, bursting upward in a ribbon of azure smoke that curled around Eleanor's wrist like a serpent. The sensation was cold and burning all at once. The whisper returned closer now, almost inside her mind. You cannot escape the hearth. It calls you. Eleanor tried to pull away, but the smoke tightened its grip, threading into her veins, into her thoughts. A memory flooded her, a vision of the woman in the black veil, standing in the hearth, singing the ancient song that bound her to the house. The fire is the story, and the story is the fire. The voice said. Eleanor gasped and yanked her hand free, collapsing backward. The smoke dissipated, but a spark lingered beneath her skin. Thorn helped her up. We need to destroy it completely. This fire, it's alive, and it's part of her. She nodded, dread pooling in her stomach. But deep inside, Eleanor knew. No matter what they did, the fire would always be waiting. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights and whispered warnings. Eleanor and Thorn left Hearthmore behind, but could never truly escape its shadow. The spark beneath her skin flickered with every heartbeat, a secret flame that pulsed in the dark. Eleanor tried to record their story notes, sketches, even voice recordings, but the house was slippery, refusing to be pinned down by reason or ink. Whenever she spoke of it aloud, her words warped, turning into riddles she couldn't solve. One night, alone in a rented cabin miles from the hilltop, Eleanor dreamt of the hearth. The black-veiled woman stood beside a blazing fire, her hands weaving smoke like threads. "You carry my story now," the woman said, voice both lullaby and curse. "And stories do not end, they only change." Eleanor woke with a start, the embers of the dream burning in her mind. She traced her hand over her wrist, where the spark lived beneath her skin. Thorn's voice echoed in her memory. The fire is the story, and the story is the fire. She realized then, the house, the woman, the fire, it wasn't just a place or a curse. It was a legacy. One she was now bound to. Eleanor stared out at the night sky, stars distant and cold. Somewhere beyond the forests and hills, Hearthmore waited. And so did she. Weeks had passed since they fled Hearthmore, but Eleanor could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows flickered in her peripheral vision, vanishing when she turned her head. Her dreams were plagued by the same black-veiled woman, always beckoning, always waiting. One evening, as twilight bled into night, Eleanor examined her wrist under the pale glow of her bedside lamp. The faintest scar had appeared a delicate spiral etched into her skin, glowing faintly blue. Her phone buzzed a message from Thorn. "We need to meet. Something's happening. I think the house followed us." She drove through winding roads to a rundown cafe on the edge of town. Thorn was already there, his face drawn and tired. "They found me last night," he said, voice low. "Figures in the fog, whispering my name. They want to bring us back." Eleanor shivered. "Who?" Thorn swallowed hard. "The others. The ones who came before us. Their stories aren't finished." He pulled from his coat a tattered piece of parchment, stained and brittle. Names, hundreds of them, scratched in a circle around a blackened hearth symbol. "Our names," Eleanor whispered. "And they want us back inside the story." Outside, the wind howled like the house itself, carrying a promise. The story was far from over. Eleanor and Thorn sat across from each other at the chipped cafe table, the yellow light flickering overhead. The parchment lay between them, brittle, but heavy with the weight of countless souls trapped by Hearthmoor's curse. "I don't understand," Eleanor said, fingers tracing the circle of names. "How can the house reach us here? We're miles away." Thorn's eyes were dark and haunted. "It's not the house, exactly. It's the fire itself. It lives inside the story, and the story lives in us now." Outside, the fog thickened, creeping like slow smoke under the doorframe. Suddenly, the door chimed. A cold wind blew in with the newcomer, a woman cloaked in black, her face hidden beneath a veil. "You can't run from it," she said softly, voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "The hearth has marked you." Eleanor's breath caught. The woman pulled back her veil, revealing empty sockets where eyes should be. "No," Eleanor whispered. "Not again." Thorn grabbed her hand. "This is only the beginning." The woman smiled, lips thin and cold. Night 3 has arrived. The veiled woman's hollow gaze pinned Eleanor to her seat. Time seemed to slow, the cafe's lights flickering as shadows stretched unnaturally. "You belong to the hearth now," the woman whispered, voice like distant thunder. "The fire remembers, and it demands its due." Eleanor's fingers trembled around Thorn's hand. "What do you want from us?" "To finish the story," the woman replied. "To write the last chapter." Suddenly, the walls seemed to breathe. The parchment on the table glowed faintly, the circle of names pulsing with dark light. Outside, the fog thickened into solid shapes, ghostly figures emerging from the mist, their faces a blur of anguish and warning. Eleanor felt the spark beneath her skin flare hot and cold all at once. Her vision blurred, and whispers filled her mind. Write or be written. Thorn pulled her to her feet. "We have to get out, now." They fled into the night, the veiled woman's voice trailing behind them. "The hearth never forgets. Neither shall you." As they disappeared into the fog, the cafe door slammed shut, the last flicker of light dying. The story was closing in. Eleanor and Thorn ran blindly through the dense fog that swallowed the narrow streets of the small town. The veiled woman's chilling voice echoed behind them, like the tolling of a death knell. The cold mist wrapped around Eleanor like a shroud, each breath burning in her lungs. Her wrist throbbed, a faint blue spiral beneath her skin pulsing in time with the pounding of her heart. "We need to find a way to break the cycle," Thorn gasped, pulling her toward a rusted old chapel at the edge of town. "There has to be a way." They pushed through the heavy wooden doors, the musty air inside thick with the scent of ancient incense and forgotten prayers. Eleanor's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the cracked pews. At the altar, a strange symbol had been carved, a hearth surrounded by a ring of names, identical to the one on the parchment. "This is a binding," Thorn explained, voice low. "A ritual to contain the fire." She nodded, determination hardening in her chest. "Then we have to reverse it." As they prepared to work, the chapel doors slammed shut behind them, locking with a final, unforgiving click. Outside, the whispers rose to a howl. The story was far from over. Inside the dim chapel, Eleanor and Thorn hurried to the altar. The hearth symbol carved into the stone pulsed faintly, almost alive. Dust motes drifted in the stale air, disturbed by their frantic movements. "We need to break the binding," Thorn said, pulling a small knife from his pocket, a relic from Hearthmoor, engraved with runes. "The fire is tethered here. If we can undo the ritual, maybe the fire's hold will weaken." Eleanor nodded, swallowing her fear. She opened the journal to the last page she had written, where a strange incantation was scrawled in shaky handwriting. Together, they began to chant the words. The air thickened, humming with ancient power. Suddenly, the hearth symbol flared bright blue. The walls shook, and whispers turned to screams. Shadows twisted at the edges of the room, forming shapes' faces distorted in agony. A voice roared, deep and furious. "You cannot unwrite the fire." The chapel doors burst open. A flood of cold wind swept through, extinguishing their candles. Eleanor felt a crushing weight press down on her chest. She looked Thorn, his face pale but resolute. "We finish this. Together." She grasped his hand tightly as the shadows closed in. Eleanor and Thorn stood side by side, hands clenched as the shadows crept closer, their voices a cacophony of sorrow and rage. The blue flame on the altar's hearth symbol flared, illuminating the chapels. Cracked walls. The air buzzed with the weight of countless souls, trapped in an endless story. Eleanor's voice barely wavered as she recited the final lines of the incantation, her heart pounding like a drum. "By ink and fire, by breath and blood, we break. These chains dissolve this flood." The shadows screamed soundless but piercing. Suddenly, a blinding light burst from the hearth symbol, washing over the room in waves of warmth and clarity. The faces in the shadows twisted, then softened, as if released from a terrible burden. The veiled woman's hollow eyes met Eleanor's one last time. There was no malice there, only sorrow. The story ends, only to begin anew. The blue flame vanished. The chapel fell silent. Eleanor and Thorn collapsed, exhausted but alive. Outside, the fog began to lift. The fire was finally out. The first light of dawn spilled gently through the stained glass windows, painting the chapel's dust motes in soft colors. Eleanor sat against the cold stone wall, her breath coming slow and steady now. Thorn was beside her, eyes closed but finally at peace. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see if the nightmare had truly ended. Eleanor flexed her fingers, feeling the faint warmth where the blue spiral had been beneath her skin. It was gone. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the journal. The pages were blank, except for one line scrawled faintly at the very end. "Every story ends, but some stories never leave us." She closed the book carefully and stood. Thorn opened his eyes and smiled weakly. "Is it really over?" he asked. "For now," Eleanor replied. They stepped outside, the sun warming their faces. Hearthmoor stood silent behind them, its dark secret sealed, at least until the next story began. Days passed with a fragile peace settling over Eleanor and Thorn. They stayed in the nearby town, avoiding the hill where Hearthmoor still loomed in the distance like a dark sentinel. The townsfolk were wary, but whispered that the curse had finally been broken. Eleanor found herself restless, unable to shake, the feeling that the house's shadow clung to her like a second skin. She kept the journal close, even though its pages remained stubbornly blank. One evening, as she walked along the edge of the woods, a cool breeze carried a faint scent, smoke, ash, and something like old paper. She paused and looked back toward Hearthmoor. In the fading light, a single window flickered with a pale blue glow. Her heart clenched. The story was not finished. Eleanor stood frozen as the blue glow pulsed once more in the distant window of Hearthmoor. Her breath caught in her throat. Despite the days of silence, despite the ritual, the fire still whispered. Thorn joined her silently, his eyes mirroring her unease. "It's not over," he said simply. A soft breeze carried the same haunting whisper from before, so faint she almost thought she imagined it. "The story never ends. Double quotes." Eleanor clenched her fists. The house waited patiently, a coiled serpent ready to strike again. "He may have won the battle," she murmured, "but the war is still burning." Together, they turned away from the hill, knowing that some stories, no matter how dark, never truly fade. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor found herself drawn deeper into the mystery of Hearthmoor than ever before. The scar on her wrist had faded, but the feeling of being watched lingered silent, patient. One night, she awoke to a faint tapping at her window. Heart pounding, she peered out into the darkness. There, silhouetted against the moonlight, was the black-veiled woman, Eleanor's. Breath caught. The woman raised a hand, delicate and pale, holding out a single page yellowed and ancient. Eleanor opened the window, and the page floated inside. It was filled with symbols and words she could not decipher, but one phrase stood out, written in bold ink: "The story waits to be told." The woman's hollow eyes met Eleanor's for a brief moment before she vanished into the night. Eleanor clutched the page tightly. The past was not done with her. Neither was the fire. Eleanor studied the mysterious page by candlelight, tracing the indecipherable symbols with trembling fingers. The fire flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance in recognition. The words whispered at the edges of her mind, teasing meaning just beyond reach. Thorn entered quietly, eyes heavy with worry. "You're still drawn to this place?" he said softly. "It's not safe." She looked up, determination shining in her gaze. "It's not just the place, Thorn. It's the story, and stories need to be told." He sighed but nodded. "Then we prepare. The next night is coming. The hearth will call again." Together, they pored over old records and local legends, piecing together fragments of the curse. Each clue was another stitch in the tapestry of Hearthmoor's dark history. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. The fire was waiting. The story was ready to be written anew. The days shortened, and the air grew chillier as autumn crept into the valley. Eleanor and Thorn prepared for the inevitable return to Hearthmoor. They gathered talismans and ancient texts, determined to confront the fire that refused to die. Local legend spoke of a gathering souls bound to the hearth, drawn back every cycle to relive the curse. Eleanor felt their weight, like a shadow, pressing on her chest. One evening, beneath a blood-red moon, they arrived once more at the foot of the hill. The path was overgrown, but the house was unmistakable, a dark silhouette against the crimson sky. Inside, the hearth was cold and silent, but Eleanor could feel the pulse beneath the floorboards. The veil woman appeared suddenly, her hollow eyes reflecting the moonlight. She smiled a slow, chilling curve. "Welcome back," she whispered. "The story continues." Eleanor squared her shoulders, clutching the ancient page tightly. "This time, we write the ending." Eleanor stepped cautiously into the dim foyer. Of Hearthmoor, the ancient page pressed tightly in her hand like a lifeline. Thorn was beside her, eyes scanning the shadows, muscles tense and ready. The house greeted them with a low hum, as if waking from a deep slumber. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of burnt wood and forgotten sorrow. The hearth before them lay cold, yet Eleanor could feel it pulsing beneath the stone alive. Waiting got suddenly. The veil woman materialized by the fireplace, her form flickering like smoke in a draught. Her hollow gaze fixed on Eleanor. "You cannot escape me," she whispered, voice like a lullaby and a threat entwined. Eleanor swallowed her fear. "I'm not here to escape. I'm here to end this." The woman smiled, and the walls around them began to ripple, transforming the room into a twisting labyrinth of fire and shadow. Eleanor and Thorn exchanged a glance, knowing the final trial had begun. The labyrinth twisted around Eleanor and Thorn, flames licking at their heels, and shadows weaving into twisted shapes that whispered their fears back to them. "Stay close," Thorn urged, gripping her hand tightly. The path ahead was shrouded in smoke, thick and suffocating. The air tasted of ash and forgotten dreams. Eleanor's mind flooded with memories, not her own faces screaming, voices calling, the crackle of fire consuming all hope. At the heart of the maze, the veil woman awaited, her form solidifying into something more tangible, more terrifying. "You must choose," she said softly. become part of the hearth story, or burn it all away and lose yourself. Eleanor's resolve wavered, but she clenched her jaw. I choose to end the story. The woman's eyes gleamed. Then prove it. Flames roared, the labyrinth closing in, and Eleanor stepped forward into the fire. Flames surged around Eleanor, swirling like a living storm, yet they did not burn her. Instead, the fire seemed to recognize her, as if the spark beneath her. Skin was a key. The heat was both agony and comfort, searing pain and cleansing balm. Eleanor closed her eyes and reached deep within, feeling the fire pulse in time with her heartbeat. The fire is the story, she whispered, voice steady, and I will write the ending. The veil woman's form wavered, flickering like a candle in the wind. Then write, she hissed, voice cracking like dry wood. Eleanor's hands moved as if guided by an unseen force. Words appeared in the air, letters formed from sparks and smoke, swirling around the room. She spoke aloud. By fire's breath and ember's light, I claim the story and the night. The flames obeyed, retreating like a tide, revealing the hearth no longer a prison, but a warm glow. Thorne stepped forward, eyes wide with awe. Eleanor felt the spark within her settle. Peaceful at last. The fire was hers, and the story was finally free. The walls of Hearthmore shimmered as the oppressive. Darkness receded, replaced by a gentle, golden light. The house no longer groaned or whispered. It breathed calmly, a living monument to endings and beginnings. Eleanor stood before the hearth, now a comforting blaze, feeling the warmth seep deep into her bones. Thorne placed a hand on her shoulder, a quiet reassurance. We did it, he said softly. She nodded, eyes scanning the room that had held so much terror, and now so much peace. The veil woman had vanished, leaving behind only a faint trace of smoke and the echo of a promise. That stories may end, but their memories lingered out. Eleanor picked up the journal. The pages, once blank, were filled now, words flowing like a river, telling the tale of the fire, the house, and the woman who had become part of it. Outside, the first rays of sunlight kissed the hilltop, and Hearthmore stood serene, no longer a prison, but a home. The story had ended, and with it, a new chapter had begun. Days after the fire was quelled, Eleanor found herself restless. The house, now peaceful, held a different kind of silence, one thick with memories and possibilities. She wandered through Hearthmore's rooms, touching the faded wallpaper, the worn banisters, feeling the history in every grain of wood. In the study, the journal lay open, pages gently turning, though no breeze stirred. A faint whisper echoed through the room, soft, almost tender. Every story leaves a trace. Eleanor smiled wistfully, realizing that though the fire was extinguished, its echo remained in the hearts of those who survived. The hearth's warmth wasn't just heat. It was a memory, a reminder that some stories never truly end. They live on in the quiet spaces between words, and Eleanor knew, deep down, that she would carry that story with her, always. Months passed, and Eleanor found herself sharing the tale, not as a ghost story whispered in fear, but as a lesson in resilience and remembrance. The journal, now bound in cracked leather, became a treasured keepsake. She visited the nearby village, speaking quietly to those willing to listen, passing on the memory of Hearthmore, not as a place of terror, but as a warning and a warning. Fulfilled. At night, she often traced the scar on her wrist, now faint, but forever a mark of the fire's touch. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, she thought she heard a soft voice carried on the breeze, a lullaby from the woman in the black veil, thanking her for the final chapter. Eleanor smiled softly. The fire might have burned out, but its story would live on. And her and those who dared remember. Years later, Eleanor sat by a small hearth in her own home, a single flame flickering gently in the hearthstone. The world outside was calm, the horrors of Hearthmore a distant memory not yet. Every so often, she felt the warmth of the fire not just on her skin, but deep within her soul, a quiet flame that never truly died. She opened the journal one last time, the pages worn but whole, and penned a final line. In every ending, there is a spark of beginning. A candle flickered and settled. Eleanor smiled, closing the book. And as the night wrapped around her, the flame whispered softly, "The story lives on." One evening, long after the house had been abandoned, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves. Near Hearthmoor's hill, the moon hung low, casting silvery light across the landscape. A lone traveler, drawn by tales half forgotten, paused at the edge of the woods. They felt a sudden chill, not from cold, but from a whisper carried on the wind. "Remember me." The traveler shivered and turned away, but the words lingered, like ashes drifting through the night air. The fire might have been extinguished, but its whisper would haunt the hills forever, a story waiting to be told again. Seasons changed, and Hearthmoor stood silent beneath the sky, its walls worn and weathered by time. But beneath the stones, deep in the earth, a faint flicker stirred, like a heartbeat waiting to be heard. One stormy night, a spark ignited in the darkness, small and fragile, but resolute. The flame whispered through the cracks, weaving stories of fire and shadow, pain and hope. And somewhere far away, Eleanor felt it, a gentle pull, a calling she could no longer ignore. The story was not over. It was only beginning again. Eleanor awoke to the soft glow of dawn filtering through her window, but something felt different, an undercurrent of unease threaded through the morning light. The spark beneath her skin, long dormant, flickered faintly. A letter lay on her doorstep, sealed with a strange wax emblem, a black flame encircled by runes. Inside, the words were simple yet chilling. "The hearth calls you home." She knew, without doubt, that Hearthmoor's story was unfinished. The fire had not truly been extinguished. It waited for her, for them, for the next chapter to be written. Eleanor stood, steeling herself for the journey back to the place where flame and shadow intertwined. The story beckoned, and she would answer. The journey back to Hearthmoor was shrouded in mist, the winding roads familiar yet foreboding. Eleanor felt the weight of every step, the pull of the past, and the promise of what lay ahead. The village greeted her with wary eyes, their silence heavier than words. Whispers followed her footsteps, warnings buried beneath polite nods. As she approached the hill, Hearthmoor loomed like a shadowed sentinel, its windows dark but alive with secrets. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and forgotten memories. The hearth pulsed softly, a heartbeat beneath the stone. Eleanor stepped forward, heart steady, ready to face the fire once more. The story was hers to finish. Eleanor stood before the hearth in the heart of Hearthmoor, the air heavy with centuries of unspoken sorrow and restless flames. The room was alive with whispers, echoes of voices, long silenced but never forgotten. The fire beneath the stones pulsed gently, waiting. She reached out her hands, feeling the warmth spread through her fingers, coursing like a living thing. The spark beneath her skin flared, no longer a curse, but a beacon. "This story ends," Eleanor whispered, "not with destruction, but with release." The Veil Woman appeared before her, no longer a shadow, but a figure of light and shadow, intertwined. Her hollow eyes softened, reflecting gratitude and peace. "You have freed us," the woman said. "The fire no longer burns to bind, but to remember." Eleanor closed her eyes, and with a breath steady and sure, she spoke the words of closure ancient, sacred, final. The flames danced upward, brighter and warmer than ever before, filling the room with golden light. The house seemed to sigh, the heavy burden lifted at last. when Eleanor opened her eyes. The hearth was a glowing ember, steady and calm. The story had ended, but its memory would live forever in the fire's gentle glow, in the hearts of those who dared to remember, and in Eleanor herself. She smiled softly, stepping away from the hearth as dawn's first light crept through the windows. The hollow hearth was finally at peace. Asterisk.